So now we're going to review how we can add and subtract. Remember, adding and subtracting fractions, you have to have the common denominator. So when you're dealing with irrational expressions, you got to make sure you get the denominators in factored form first. So if I factor x squared minus 4, it factors into x plus 2, x minus 2. Every set of parentheses is a factor. So each different factor has to make an appearance in the LCD. Notice you've got an x plus 2 in the bottom of this fraction, so I know one factor in my LCD has to be an x plus 2. In the bottom of my second fraction, I already have the x plus 2, so I don't need to write it again. However, I do have a different factor, which is an x minus 2. So my least common denominator is going to be an x plus 2, x minus 2. So remember, in order to add fractions together, the bottoms have to be the same. So I know that the bottom of each fraction has to look like this x plus 2 times x minus 2. So I'm going to go ahead and write what the bottom of each fraction should look like. So notice in my first fraction, I already have the x plus 2, which I already have written on what I want the bottoms to look like. What's missing, however, is the x minus 2. So what has to happen is I have to multiply the x minus 2 on the top of this first fraction. So I need to distribute the 3, so that's going to give me a 3x minus 6. Again, if I distribute the 3, that's where I get the 3x minus 6. Plus, notice what I want the bottom of the fraction to look like, x plus 2x minus 2. That's already on the bottom of my fraction, so I don't need to multiply any missing parts to the top or the bottom. So my numerator is just going to be an x minus 2. So remember, the way you add fractions, you're going to leave the bottom alone, and I'm going to combine like terms in the top. I'm adding. So 3x plus x is a 4x. Negative 6 minus 2 is going to give me a minus 8. You always want to make sure that your fractions are in simplest form. I've already got my denominator in factored form. Let me see if I can factor the numerator, which I can. I can pull out a 4 over my LCD. And you can see you have a common factor you can cross out. I can cross out those x minus 2's. So I'm left with a 4 over x plus 2. You add and subtract in the same process. Get that common denominator. So notice in number 13, there's no factoring to be done for either denominator. So let's see if I can identify what that LCD is going to be. Notice in the bottom of my first fraction, I have an x minus 3. So I need to have an x minus 3 in the LCD. Second fraction has a single x. So I do have to consider that single x. So the bottom of each fraction is going to have to be an x times x minus 3. And remember, it's a subtraction. So when you look at the first fraction, notice I already have the x minus 3. The piece that's missing is the x. So I have to multiply top and bottom by that x. So again, I'm going to distribute the x. So that's going to give me an x squared plus x. So now notice the second fraction already has an x on the bottom. The piece that's missing is the x minus 3. So the top and bottom will get multiplied by the x minus 3. And I need to distribute the 5. So I have 5x minus 15. Now remember, you're subtracting. So when I go to combine this into one large fraction, I know the bottom is going to stay the same. So what I have to do is subtract the numerator. Nothing I can combine with x squared, so that stays on the top. Notice I have an x minus a 5x. So x minus a 5x is going to give me a minus 4x. Again, you have to remember, this is subtraction. You've got to distribute that subtraction sign to the negative 15, which will give me a plus 15. I cannot factor the numerator, so I know that this answer is going to be in simplest form. So when you take a look at number 14, again, neither denominator can be factored. So let's identify the LCD. Now, we're dealing with sines and cosines. I already have a sine theta in the bottom of the first fraction. So I know I'm going to have that single sine theta as part of the LCD. Here, I've got one big expression that's a binomial, sine theta plus 1. That's got to be a part of my LCD. So I know what the bottom of each fraction has to look like. It's got to be a sine theta times sine theta plus 1. So if you look at the first fraction, you already have a sine theta. The piece that's missing is this sine theta plus 1. So I have to multiply the top and bottom by a sine theta plus 1, the missing part. So I am going to have to FOIL. Sine times sine is a sine squared theta. Minus 5 sine theta for the outer. Inner is going to be a plus 1 sine theta. So when I add negative 5 plus 1, that's a minus 4 sine theta. And then 1 times negative 5 is a negative 5. So now I've taken care of the first fraction. Now let's look at the second one. Notice I already have a sine theta plus 1. The piece that's missing is the sine theta. So I'm going to have to multiply the top and bottom by a sine theta. So I'm going to use my distributive property. That's going to give me a sine squared theta minus 2 sine theta. So all I've done is I've rewritten each fraction with a common denominator. So I know now when I combine this into one big fraction what the bottom is going to look like. Now I want to combine like terms in the numerator. Sine squared plus sine squared is a 2 sine squared. I have a minus 4 sine theta minus 2 sine theta, which is a minus 6 sine theta. And I have my minus 5. There are no factors of negative 10. When I can add together, give me negative 6. So I know that that is in simplest form. So in number 15, let's see what the LCD is going to be. I have a cosine theta minus 3 on the bottom of this fraction, cosine theta plus 3 on the bottom of the second fraction. So my LCD is going to be a cosine theta minus 3 times cosine theta plus 3. So that's what the bottom of each fraction is going to have to look like. So now in the bottom of my first fraction, I already have the cosine theta minus 3, which is right here. The piece that's missing is the cosine theta plus 3. So I'm going to have to distribute the 4. So that's 4 cosine theta plus 12. I already have a cosine theta plus 3 on the bottom. I'm missing this cosine theta minus 3. So I have to multiply top and bottom by that cosine theta minus 3. I have to distribute the cosine. So that gives me a cosine squared theta minus 3 cosine theta. Don't forget this is subtraction. So again, there's parentheses around numerators and denominators of fractions. So you've got to remember to distribute the subtraction sign all the way across that numerator. So I have a 4 cosine theta minus negative 3 cosine theta. So minus and negative becomes a positive. So now I'm going to have plus 7 cosine theta. I have a negative cosine squared theta when I distribute the negative sign to cosine squared. Plus 12. All over your cosine theta minus 3 cosine theta plus 3. There are no factors of negative 12 that add together give me a positive 7, so this is as simplified as I can take it.